So there's a lot to explore when you're stitching panoramics, but let's take a look in Lightroom. And Lightroom CC has added panoramic stitching, which does make things a lot easier. So here I have my whole series of images from one of our Teton landscapes, going from the far right to the far left, and you can see it was quite a few stitches to go across. By the way, a handy thing out in the field, I'll stick my hand in front of the lens to let me know that it's the beginning or end of a panoramic stitch. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pieces to stitch. So let's go ahead and select all 11 of those. And then we'll go up to Photo, Photo Merge, Panorama. You see these different panoramic projections here: spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. In general, if you're going to be stitching a vertical shot like we have here, a series of verticals, you're probably going to want to stick to spherical. The downside of cylindrical, if you're doing vertical pano stitches like this, is it has a tendency to stretch the image vertically, which is not something you're going to want. Spherical is going to work best for verticals. If you're doing a horizontal, you might find cylindrical works best. Perspective, I have found it rare to be the correct projection, because what it does is it assumes that the things in the middle of the image are further away from you than the ones on either side. So what it does is it ends up creating a distortion where the middle of the image is very far away and on either side it gets closer, and that's rarely the case. It also costs you a lot of cropping. So in general, perspective is rare that I find it works. Spherical works great for me for vertical stitching, cylindrical for horizontal stitching. Okay, so here's our spherical projection. Now you do see this fall off in the corners, and that is the nature of the projection. It's actually projecting the image onto a sphere. If you absolutely want to maintain every little edge, then you have to export this into Photoshop, and you can do a stitch called a reposition. And we'll take a look at this image in a minute to see how it looks repositioned instead of being done in Lightroom. However, that said, notice how everything lines up, how we have a perfectly straight line across the top and the bottom. And this happened because we were on this panel rig. By having the panel rig level and then having those rotations from right to left, we got a perfectly level stitch and the best quality possible. Now there is an auto crop button here, which will get rid of the areas that were projected into those corners. And there's our image. So I'll go ahead and merge that. And one of the beauties of when you're doing this in Lightroom is it is still a raw file. You can then go ahead and do all of your standard Lightroom edits to this, and then they will be rendered when the file is exported. But just as an example, let's go ahead and take these 11 images, and we're going to send the export into Photoshop, where we can do a panoramic stitch using reposition instead of one of these projections. So here's our final pano stitch as we see it in Lightroom. Again, let's take all 11 of these and send them into Photoshop. So to do that, you go to Photo, Edit In, and then Merge to Panorama in Photoshop. So here we see our 11 images, and you see you have some more projections here. And I'm going to go to reposition. Again, reposition is something you can pull off when you did shoot on a panel rig, because it's really going to make everything stitch together cleanly. So let's hit OK. And Photoshop will open up each of the 11 images, find an appropriate place to blend the edges together, and give us a stitch without any projection distortions. Alright, so here's the Photoshop stitch, and notice when we used reposition, you can see that with the exception of just a couple of pixels, just from my own not being perfectly horizontal, that we didn't lose a single thing. All of the images, all of the pieces stitched together beautifully. Oh, by the way, when you see these little crack lines here, that's just an artifact of the blending. So if we go ahead and just flatten this, that will all go away. So let's let that do its thing. So we go back into Lightroom, and here is the Photoshop stitch. You can see we've lost nothing compared to stitching in Lightroom. And which one you like better is going to be somewhat your choice. Lightroom does a nice job. Photoshop does a perfect job. And again, having this panoramic rig eliminates having to do any of these projections that cause that distortion or loss in height or width. By going into Photoshop and having the panoramic rig do the stitching, you can just use that position, reposition mode of doing stitching, and you get everything from every one of your frames. Very cool stuff.